All right, welcome back to part two of section four. We'll be finishing this section today. So, yesterday we discussed um, what the abolitionist movement was, and today we're going to start with how it's going to gain momentum. So, um, a growing number of reformers known as abolitionists will want to end slavery completely in the United States. And so they're going to have two different theories about how to do this. The first one, a group will favor a gradual end to slavery. And to do this, they just kind of expect it to die out on its own if it was kept out of Western territories. So, in their minds, that as long as we kept slavery out of the Western territories, slavery will eventually die out in the South just because it's so isolated to one region. Others, though, demand that slavery end everywhere at once. And to do this, you'd need more of a national push from the national government than just the state governments. And so the abolitionist movement will be divided. However, almost all abolitionists, were Northerners, and and the movement gradually gained strength from the 1820s through the 1840s, and even more quickly in the 1850s due to several factors. So John Adams, who was originally a diplomat for the United States to France and Great Britain, then he was elected president before he wins a seat in the House of Representatives. And John Adams will be considered an abolitionist. So here, as a member of the House of Representatives, he would propose a constitutional amendment that would eventually end slavery by declaring all newborn children free. So if you were already a slave, well, under this constitutional amendment, you would stay a slave, but any kids you have, they will be considered free and not slaves. So eventually, slavery would die out because of this. The problem was, though, that the Southern congressmen had an agreement passed that Congress would not discuss anything having to do with slavery. Now, this agreement was in 1830, right before Adams became a member of the House. And as a result of this agreement, Adams' proposal would ultimately be ignored by Congress, and his idea for this amendment would just die out. Now, African Americans were abolitionists themselves, and mainly free African Americans that will play a key role in this abolitionist movement by actively challenging the existence of slavery. And so they will have several key driving forces there. Some will try to end slavery through lawsuits and petitions. However, these will ultimately be ignored for the most part because nobody really took the African Americans seriously in court. Others would start newspapers or give public speeches to try and persuade public opinion against slavery. So some will try to do this through the court system. They will be very unsuccessful. Most of the momentum they will gain, though, will be through public opinion and trying to turn the public against slavery. So Frederick Douglass would be the best known African American abolitionist. Um, and he was born into slavery in Maryland. And as a child, he would defy the slave codes by learning to read. So remember, we talked about the slave codes a little while back and what African Americans were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And one of those things was they were not allowed to read. However, Frederick Douglass will learn how to read anyway. In 1838, though, he will escape slavery and make his way to New England. So we're talking like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, those states. Here in New England, he would attend an anti slavery meeting where he would speak for the first time about slavery and the meaning of freedom to African Americans, and basically how they're denied it and how harsh slavery is actually on people. And because this first speech he gave went so well, Douglass will begin speaking across the nation. And in 1847, he would begin publishing an anti-slavery newspaper, which was called the North Star. The reason why they called it the North Star is slaves that were trying to escape would look to the North Star to find north and escape self-freedom. Now, civil disobedience to the Underground Railroad will also play a large part. Some abolitionists will form what we call the Underground Railroad. And now, the thing to remember, this isn't a real railroad by any means. However, it is a network of abolitionists who secretly helped enslaved African Americans escape to freedom in the North or Canada. So, first, going to the North was enough at first. However, once they passed some more laws that we haven't talked about yet, African Americans will have to sneak all the way to Canada before they can actually be free from slavery with no way of being able to return to it. Conductors would guide runaways to quote unquote stations where they could spend the night. Now, the conductors were um, either abolitionists or already slaves that had run away and became free. So these stations were homes of abolitionists, or others were churches or even caves, basically anywhere they could hide out for the night to get rest before they would continue on. And they didn't always spend the night somewhere. Usually they'd spend the day somewhere and travel at night. Conductors would sometimes hide runaways under loads of hay in wagons with false bottoms. So these wagons would essentially have two bottoms to them, and that would create a space in between them where the slaves could hide underneath the hay. So even if the hay was loaded off the wagon, or sorry, taken off the wagon, they would still be hidden in that false area. And the thing to remember, though, it's illegal to help enslaved African Americans escape. But these conductors felt strongly about disobeying laws they considered unjust. And the disobeying of unjust laws is considered civil disobedience. So these acts of disobeying the laws was called civil disobedience and led thousands of enslaved people to freedom. So, civil disobedience, by definition, is disobeying unjust laws. And this isn't the only time we'll talk about civil disobedience. When you guys get to high school, we will talk about it quite a bit, especially when we get to the civil rights movement, because civil disobedience will be the main driving force on how things will be brought about and changed. So one very famous conductor is Harriet Tubman, and she herself actually escaped slavery before she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She felt committed to freeing others from slavery and risked her freedom and life to return to the South 19 different times. And she would leave more than 300 enslaved African Americans, including her own parents, to freedom on these 19 trips. Abolitionists were one interest group in the controversy over slavery. There are going to be other interest groups. Even in the North, there will be people that are against abolition. So the abolitionist view would be that slavery had to end, whereas Northern mill owners, bankers, and merchants who depended on cotton from the South, they're going to have kind of a different point of view than these abolitionists. Some would see attacks on slavery as a threat to their livelihood. So, because the northern mill owners, bakers, and merchants relied heavily on this cotton from the South and therefore slavery, they felt threatened by the end of slavery. Also, some northern workers would oppose abolition as well, and they feared that African Americans might come to the North and take their jobs by working for low pay. So, these northern mill workers are afraid of losing their jobs to African Americans. So, they're against abolitionists because of this reason. They don't want slavery to end, mainly because they're afraid of losing their jobs. And so these interest groups in the North will take a view that slavery should be left up to individual states. Now, they're not going to necessarily say that, well, slavery is a good thing, we need to keep it around, but they're going to say instead of the national government just banning slavery throughout the United States, we should leave it up to the individual states whether or not they want to allow slavery. And because few Southerners actually opposed slavery, their view was that slavery should be allowed to continue. So essentially, by leaving it up to the individual states, slavery was not going to go anywhere because the South relied so heavily on it, and so few people in the South were against it. In northern cities, oftentimes mob would sometimes break up anti-slavery meetings or attack homes of abolitionists. Now, this would also have some drawbacks for those mobs. The attacks would sometimes backfire and win support for the abolitionists because if people were willing to go to such extremes to kind of quiet them, then they had to be onto something. And so most white Southerners were disturbed by the growing abolitionist movement. So the South was not a big fan of this movement as it was starting to grow. And the Southern and this is mainly because the Southern economy depended on slavery, and Southerners strongly supported slavery, even if they were not slave owners personally. So these people that even if they didn't own slaves wanted slavery around because their economy just depends on it. And without these slaves, the Southern economy was thought to basically it was just going to collapse. And they accused abolitionists of preaching violence, and many Southerners would blame even Nat Turner's rebellion on these abolitionists who were talking about bringing a call to arms and slave revolts. And slave owners will respond to the abolitionist efforts by defending slavery even more. And they're going to do this by saying that slaves are treated well and they actually enjoy their work and what they're doing. And also, they will argue that slaves were better off than northern factory workers because they work in the outdoors and not in stuffy, dangerous factories. And many Southerners will also believe that the Northerners' support for the anti slavery movement was stronger than it really was. And so they will begin to fear that Northerners wanted to destroy their way of life. So before we end, the last point is going to be very, very critical, especially in the next coming sections and leading up to the Civil War. So even though not a ton of Northerners necessarily supported this huge nationwide anti-slavery movement, um, the Southerners would kind of blow that number out of proportion and felt that the North was just against slavery and out to destroy the Southern way of life and their economy. And because of this, you're going to start seeing a huge rift between the slave states and non slave states in the North and the South going forward from this point on. Um, so it's going to be very important to keep that in mind going forward and remember that. So your homework today is to complete the online quiz on the book website. Make sure you get that done. I will be putting that in the grades book very soon. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And once again, keep checking back to my teacher website as we go forward with our little Corona vacation. So, once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.